Picture it, America, the 1980s. Reagan is in the White House. Pop stars are declaring that we are the world and asking if we know if it's Christmas. And Americans are pondering heavy existential questions like, where's the beef? For most of the decade, there were only 3 networks airing primetime comedies. And yet, some of those shows were so strong, with writing and acting so sharp, that they continue to influence TV even 4 decades later. It's time we give them their due. So join the great pop culture debate as we determine the best 80s sitcom. You take the good, you take the bad, you take them both, and then you have my largely unsatisfying sexual history. It's just the facts of Grindr life. I'm your host, Eric Rezsnyak. Please help me welcome my panelists for this episode. When she inevitably gets overruled on a 3-1 call, she won't waste another minute of her crying. It's Amma Marfo.
When it comes to me losing on this podcast, we're nowhere near the end.
Amma, I know that we've had some growing pains, but I hope you'll keep showing us that smile again. Next, he wasn't locked in an abandoned refrigerator like Punky Brewster's friend, but he has forever scarred by that episode. It's Brendan Hay.
And, like an 80s sitcom, I might be replaced halfway through this recording by Ted McGinley.
We could never replace you, Brendan, but we might push you directly into syndication. And finally, we have an extra special guest star for this episode. He's a renowned comedian, voiceover artist, and actor, and his new comedy special, Path of Most Resistance, is available right now on YouTube. Please welcome James Adomian.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you for coming, and cheers to you, James. Up in the producer booth, we have Bob Erlenbach, who is taking a much-needed vacation to Mypos. If you're curious about how we ended up with this Sitcom 16, become a Patreon supporter of the podcast, or listen to the 3-minute primer available wherever you listen to podcasts. And don't forget, you can head to this episode on greatpopculturedebate.com and find the listener bracket, as well as all 16 clips of the shows we'll be discussing, so you can play along with us at home. And with that out of the way, let's gather around a cheesecake and dig into these debates. First up, we have 2 unanimous victories, with ultimate number 1 seed the Golden Girls proving that 4 seed Happy Days won't be here again, and 3 seed The Facts of Life boarding up all the votes opposite 2 seed Growing Pains. Is anyone interested in talking about those shows? Brendan, I see you nodding your head. Do you have thoughts about either Happy Days or Growing Pains?
My only thought on Growing Pains was, as a kid growing up on Long Island, I felt very seen having a sitcom set on Long Island. So I have a special place in my heart for Growing Pains forever for that. That special place has largely been stomped by everything Kirk Cameron's done for his ridiculous right-wing agenda in the last 20, 30 years. But, that said, I'll show you that smile again.
Amma, were you going to say anything about either Happy Days or Growing Pains?
I was. I do think that when it comes to Growing Pains, it's one of more than what we have multiple shows on the bracket here that in some cases the behavior of a star has overshadowed the legacy of the show. And I think that and it being relatively less accessible via streaming hurts it. And having watched some of it fairly recently, because it's just now finally coming back to some linear streaming, I get what the appeal was, but I also kind of recognize, like, not unlike another show on the bracket, someone's bad or questionable behavior kind of ruined it for everybody. And then when it comes to Happy Days, I think it being an 80s sitcom kind of surprises some people because it's set in the 50s, so you kind of have to recalibrate a little bit. So I'm sure in some capacity that kind of hurt it here as well.
For sure. James, did you happen to watch Happy Days back in the day?
I did. I watched it on syndication all the time. I don't remember which station necessarily. Maybe it was TBS. I'm not sure, but it would come on not far after. Like I think it came on after something like Gilligan's Island, or that I was watching a lot, and like I saw a lot of it. And I'm talking about when I'm a little kid. I'm like 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, and there's. The Fonz is like a perfect cartoon for a child of like what a cool older teenager is.
Totally. And I mean, the show created not just big stars, and I mean, Ron Howard was already a star, but like kind of repositioned him, and Henry Winkler, but it gave us a ton of spin-offs. Laverne and Shirley, Mork and Mindy, both came off of that, as well as 3 other shows, including Joni Loves Chachi, which we're not going to talk about, but it also literally gave us Jump the Shark. Like that comes from Happy Days. It was from 1977 when Fonzie jumped the shark. So it is a legendary TV show. Just as we record this, got its honor for its 50th anniversary at the Emmys. But at least we talked about it a little bit, but it will be moving out of the bracket. Next, 3/4 of the the panel wants us to see 4-seed the Jeffersons moving on up into round 2, but Brendan has breaking news. He's pulling for 1-seed Murphy Brown. Amma, make sure the Jeffersons keep getting a piece of the pie. Brendan, piss off Dan Quayle some more by giving us your expose on Murphy Brown. Brendan, please go first.
Sure thing. And honestly, this is a case of I actually love the Jeffersons, but I have this weird thing where all Norman Lear sitcoms immediately read 1970s to me, regardless of when they came out. So that's my biggest thing, that just Jefferson reads more that way to me. Murphy Brown, on the other hand, is pure 80s. It felt like, so as a, like, similar to James, like as a 6, 7, 8-year-old somehow watching this felt like I was getting to see like the big movies that my parents wouldn't let me see, of like Broadcast News or The Big Chill or stuff like that. It's like, here's the TV version of it. And I just felt so adult watching it, even though like I'd quoted a 4th grade lunch and I was not popular as a result, but it made me laugh a lot. Plus, I think it was a little bit of my introduction personally to political comedy. I think the performance was really good. It did have a bit of that like 1980s version of a Mary Tyler Moore kind of vibe with the way the ensemble played off each other. And watching clips, I was happy to see it still holds up as being funny.
Yeah. And I mean, Candace Bergen is so good in that show. Great. She's incredible. I'm going to blow your mind with something. Murphy Brown was on the air for 2 years of the 80s, 88, 89. The Jeffersons were on the air for 5 years of the 80s. It started in 75 and continued to 85. Even though it feels like a 70s show, it actually was mostly an 80s show. Since this is a 3-1, I do want to ask my other panelists, James, has he swayed you, or are you going to stick with the Jeffersons?
I stick with the Jeffersons. It's such, I mean, it's a catchy theme song. I think it's a far catchier theme song, and that plays in my memory and in my enjoyment of things. Like sometimes that's the greatest hook.
Sure. Is
the theme song, and it's one of the greatest theme songs of a TV show in all of history. And I think there's some fantastic, hilarious performances in that.
Yeah, there are. I was going to say, Amma, I'm assuming you're sticking with the Jeffersons.
Yes, and James, I'm glad to know that theme song factored in for more than one person. It definitely did for me. But yeah, just there's something about the Jeffersons that, and I don't want to burn too much argument because it'll be moving forward, but there is kind of a timeless enjoyment of it to me, whereas I think Murphy Brown I would enjoy a great deal now, but when I was a kid, I was like, what? And the Jeffersons, I think I enjoyed just as much when I was 8, 9, 10 when I first discovered it as I do now.
For me, this is one of those ones that fell into the Murphy Brown always felt like a 90s sitcom to me. And when you talk about its kind of pop culture pinnacle in relevance, it was the 90s. But we will be moving the Jeffersons into round 2. I'll have to give your argument for it then. Next, the panel is currently split between 3-seed M.A.S.H. and 2-seed Who's the Boss? Brendan, suicide may be painless, but why would it hurt to see M.A.S.H. out so quickly in this debate? James, show us the Judith Light as you explain why we should move Who's the Boss into round 2. James, do you mind going first?
I can go first. Who's the Boss puts the situation in situation comedy. It is like iconic and almost like defines the category of what a sitcom is, because it's like, what happens? It might seem slightly dated to us, but it was like kind of groundbreaking at the time. And it's like, what happens if the man is working for the woman?
Wow.
And also, is there a sexual tension? There should be, but there shouldn't be. I guess it was like interesting and innovative to see like a macho actor playing like the second fiddle, or in a position where he's not the boss. And that's the premise right in the title and everything.
Yeah, I mean, it is a great ensemble group. And you're right. Like, in the 80s, that was a whole thing. Remember Mr. Mom with Michael Keaton? Like, that was like, what if the man takes care of the kids in the house and the woman goes to work? What? Crazy. And I love that about the 80s. But Brendan, talk to us about M.A.S.H.
Yeah, so look, this is another one, honestly, I'd be tempted to call it more 70s. However, the last episode of M.A.S.H. was the most viewed episode of anything on television in the 1980s. That's how big M.A.S.H. was at that time. And rewatching it now, I feel like it actually plays a little more uneven than maybe it did then, but it was trying to actually evolve the form. Like, TV wouldn't be where TV is now without M.A.S.H. So it's a little bit of just wanting to give it its credit where credit is due. I mean, it was a single cam show long before that was involved in any kind of comedy. It incorporated drama and like some really dark laughs kind of mixed in. And I'm going to throw in my little last personal thing. Most of all, it didn't star Tony Danza. Like, I love Catherine Hellman. I love Judith Light. But yeah, I'll throw out my very quick version of my Tony Danza story from when I worked in late night. He was a guest once. There was a writer on the show whose brother was a humongous fan of Tony Danza's from Taxi and Who's the Boss. He brought his brother there hoping the Booker on the show is like, yeah, of course. The guests are always fine with that. You can have them meet them. This guest was not. Tony Danza, as the brother and the writer, are waiting outside of the green room. The booker just goes in first. I'll just do the little setup, have you guys come in. The booker goes in and they get to overhear Tony Danza go. It's like, oh, she's like, a writer and his brother would love to meet you. Tony Danza goes, writer's brother? Writer, maybe. Definitely not writer's brother.
Oh, Tony Danza.
So I throw that out just as my strike against Who's the Boss.
I hope that the writer and the writer sibling then went back and watched those photos of him falling during the gates when he was rollerblading through Central Park. That's called karma. Amma, between M.A.S.H and Who's the Boss, where are you voting?
I had originally picked M.A.S.H, and this was a difficult decision to begin with, just because, like Brendan said, the impact that it had on television overall was really big, whereas I think Who's the Boss feels more emblematic of the 80s. I do think I could be swayed to Who's the Boss here, because when I think about what feels quintessentially 80s, part of that for me is if you tried to drop it and put it somewhere else, would it make sense? M.A.S.H could fit in the 70s. Who's the Boss? I don't know. So I'm going to give it to Who's the Boss here. I'm going to allow myself to be swayed.
Yeah, I'm also going with Who's the Boss here. M.A.S.H is incredible, important television, and everything you said is correct. It moved the form. It had 100 Emmy nominations, and it won 14 of them. It has a place in TV history, but I don't consider it a sitcom. M.A.S.H is to sitcoms as The Bear is to sitcoms, except M.A.S.H was funnier. It was about war. So, like, for me, Who's the Boss is the better sitcom, not necessarily TV series. So, Who's the Boss will move into round 2. Next, it's another unanimous decision, as everyone said 1 seed Cheers' name instead of 4 seed The Simpsons. I suspect this is likely a combination of Cheers being an 80s juggernaut and The Simpsons literally just barely qualifying for this bracket, seeing as it debuted a mere 14 days before the end of the 80s on December 17th, 1989. I mean, we all love The Simpsons. Eat My Shorts, Don't Have a Cowman. I had the t-shirts. No, it's a hugely influential show, but it's a 90s show to me. And for that reason, go check out our best 90s sitcom episode. It exists. Oh, they're also in the best 2000 sitcom episode, and we'll be in the best 2010s and 2020 sitcom episode when we do those episodes. But we are moving Cheers into round 2. Next, it's another even split between 2 long-running NBC series, 3 seed The Cosby Show and 2 seed Night Court. Brendan, litigate Night Court's chances of making it into round 2. Amma, I'm not going to make any shitty puns about The Cosby Show. I'm just going to ask you to speak on it. So, Brendan, I'm going to have you go first.
Sure. This one, genuinely tough call. Unless you want to go, it's either a really tough call or a very easy call. If you want to bring outside factors into it, it becomes a very easy call to vote Night Court. Outside of that, like in terms of the actual shows, Cosby Show is fantastic. My slight preference for Night Court, it was broad and cartoony and silly in a way that was really refreshing and kind of unique in the 80s. Rewatching it in my mind was always like, oh yeah, this was kind of like the forerunner to that 30 Rock Faye Carlack style of like super dense jokes, like just a lot of jokes very quick. And yeah, rewatching it was. It's also as broad as like an adult sitcom now. Adult animated sitcom now. So yeah, it's just kind of its own fun, weird thing. And going to theme songs, best sax solo this side of Baker Street.
Don't get me started on saxophones. Don't get me started. You know how I think about them. I love them.
I know.
Amma, talk to us about The Cosby Show.
I love Night Court, and it's another one of those where being able to appreciate it more now than when I think I first encountered it made this a difficult decision, but at the same time, like, it's just kind of it's hard to overestimate the degree to which The Cosby Show kind of changed representation of Black families on TV. Talking a little bit about, like, the Norman Lear of it all, there was a very specific kind of look for Black families between the Jeffersons, where they had started from, versus where they ended up, and then Good Times and all of those things. And The Cosby Show broke that open in such a really welcome way at the time that it's kind of hard to overestimate that. And again, alluding to the fact that there's more than one show here that got hurt in so many ways by bad behavior of a star, we'd be having a very different conversation about The Cosby Show were it not for that. So for me, when we're talking about best show, independent of the influences that made it and then ruined it for everybody, this comes out on top for me.
James Adomian, this is a tough one. Where are you? Is it The Cosby Show or is it Night Court?
You know, Amma made a very good argument. I had chosen Night Court with some consideration of, you know, the title name star of The Cosby Show.
Yeah.
And some of the stuff that came out that was happening at that time. But I suppose if one were going to separate the art from the artist, it is undeniable that the Cosby Show was groundbreaking. And it was also a funny show, and there was a lot of other people on it besides the big star, obviously. There was a lot of funny scenes that didn't even involve him.
Yeah.
And I mean, Night Court is really funny. It's an interesting premise. I like the setup, but I think, I think I might be convinced to change my mind here on this one. After oral arguments, ironically here, Night Court maybe loses the case.
Yeah, I am also on Team Cosby Show here. I do, and I'll just tip my hat that was one thing I had to take a step back, like separating art from artist, and it's going to come in a couple places here. Cosby Show, I mean, it was the #1 show on television for all of 85 to 89. Like, there's a reason for that. It wasn't just by mistake. So, with that being said, we're going to move the Cosby Show into round 2. Next, the majority of the panel wants to keep growing with 1-seed Family Ties, but James prefers the odd couple shenanigans of 4-seed Perfect Strangers. James, tell us why, even with these odds, nothing's going to stop Perfect Strangers now. I will ask, what would we do, baby, without Family Ties in the Elite 8? Okay. James, please go first.
I'll give you this. Family Ties has a great theme song. Family Ties has a young star in his prime, Michael J. Fox. Family Ties has an interesting situation with, the right-wing teenager and the older liberals, which is kind of a flip against the way it's supposed to be. And I watched both these shows, and I would watch either one of them if it came on. If I'm in a hotel room, I would watch the full 30 minutes of either one of these. But I think Perfect Strangers is such an 80s idea. There's the Iron Curtain. It's basically it's like a Cold War. It's a late Cold War sitcom.
Yeah.
And there's something that's so deliciously dated for me there. And I'm a sucker for Eastern European things. And like, Soviet era cartoons and things like that. And this is sort of the tail end of that. And there's 2 really funny actors.
Yeah.
They are 2 really, really funny actors that carry the thing. And in very different styles, like a broad sort of physical comedy, like The Language Mistakes, which is an old vaudeville trick, and then there's the dry, the other side of it, where it's like the absolute dry straight man who probably, to my mind, is if Michael Caine is the best in movies for like the dry reaction shot. Then I gotta say in Perfect Strangers, my God, I'm forgetting.
Cousin Larry is the character's name.
Yeah, Mark Lynn Baker.
Thank you, Mark Lynn Baker.
Mark Lynn Baker was so good at those, like, Balky, you can't do that, and I mean, as a young kid, I kind of latched onto that kind of thing. Very, very simple. Very dated in a good way, where it's like, oh, this is the 80s. This is the time of, don't turn around. Call me Saws in Town. Where it's like this East meets West thing that we haven't done in a while.
Yeah, it's a great argument. You've kind of got me on the fence here, which is to your credit, because I was fully on Team Family Ties before this. I will say Bronson Pinchot and Mark Lynn Baker are excellent in Perfect Strangers. Really great casts. For me, Family Ties kind of is the 80s in sitcom form, right? Like, it ran almost the entire decade, 82 to 89. And what was more American culture at the time than young people turning conservative yuppies and just eschewing any type of ethics to make a buck, right? Like, that was the whole story. I will say that the cast here was great. The whole ensemble. You had Michael Gross and Meredith Baxter / Bernie, depending on when she was in her career. Great as the parents. You had Michael J. Fox as Alex B. Keaton, who was the breakout, but Mallory was also played by Justine Bateman. She was great. Tina Yothers was great as the tomboy sister. I just thought it was a really strong show. Like, it was a pretty basic idea, but I thought the execution was very high. The Writers Guild of America named it number 95 on its shows of the best written TV series of all time. Entertainment Weekly ranked it in its 100 greatest television shows of all time. And important, and this can sway your decision either way, it was Ronald Reagan's favorite TV series. So so take that as you will. Brendan, where are you? Is it going to be Perfect Strangers or Family Ties?
So it was going to be Family Ties. Both James's argument and the Ronald Reagan info has helped push me. I was on the fence anyway, Perfect Strangers.
Okay, awesome. Amma, where are you?
Sorry, having a physical reaction over it being Ronald Reagan's favorite TV show. Like, that to me feels like when I found out, like, oh yeah, Donald Trump loves Citizen Kane. I was like, he didn't get it. And I'm so
No,
upset.
he did not.
But that aside, when we're talking about things that are quintessentially 80s, so like the intergenerational dynamic, but also is there anything more 80s American or not than the popularity of Bronson Pinchot? So I feel like we have to give it to Perfect Strangers on that alone.
I'm living for this change, and so we are going to go ahead and move Perfect Strangers into round 2. Well done, James Adomian. That was a big switch. Finally, in round 1, it's another 3-1 split, as the bulk of the panel wants 3-seed Designing Women to decorate round 2, while James has his eye set on the comfy couch of 2-seed Roseanne. James, tell us why you'd be blue to see Roseanne's working class Connors out in round 1. I will let you know, so your children will someday know, why this will not be the round when the lights go out for Designing Women. James, please go first.
Designing Women is very funny, and it's kind of like, I think it's kind of like an iconic gay show too, in the fans and in the aesthetic and everything. And I love that Atlanta was the center stage of it, because I think up to that point you didn't see a lot of Atlanta as like a setting for big for TV shows. I think Roseanne is, there are some of the funniest moments I've ever seen on a TV show or in Roseanne. And you do have to do a lot of separation of the art from the artist here. Before she was driving around with a dead bear cub with Robert Kennedy Jr. in Manhattan, she was super famous, well-deserved. She was a liberal icon back then. She was a populist liberal icon, and she carried this fantastic show that all the little side characters, all the rest of the family are all hilarious. Well thought out, well played, different family types. And her husband,
John Goodman
is what he's like the cornerstone of the O'Connor family, and he has some of the driest, funniest lines. And she's big, she's hilarious, but I'll tell you, I remember it. I have always remembered this joke. There's one episode where one of the kids is asking, like, well, so-and-so said they're religious in school. What religion are we? And Roseanne has the setup to the joke where she goes, well, I guess we just kind of believe in being good people and treating people pretty well. And her husband walks in and he goes, yeah, but we're not practicing.
Classic.
And I mean, there's stuff like that that's like very, very memorable. And it was nice to see in the 1980s sort of a counterpoint to the Wall Street thing.
Yeah.
Where there was like a lower middle class working family that was the center of attention. And it wasn't the first time ever that we saw something from that perspective, but it was unusually funny for something like that.
Yeah, that's a great argument. And I have to say, I actually decided even before we started this that I was switching my vote here. I'm going to talk about Designing Women, but I mentioned earlier, the whole separating art from the artist. I had voted down Roseanne because of the Roseanne bar of it all, but that's not fair if I'm also voting for the Cosby Show. But I do want to talk about Designing Women here. The strength of this show is, number one, that ensemble. That original ensemble is 100% fire. Dixie Carter, Delta Burke, Jean Smart, Annie Potts, Meshack Taylor, like 10s across the board, right? And then it had really strong writing, especially the episodes that were written by the co-creators, Lyndall Bloodworth Thompson and Harry Thompson. Very sharp. You mentioned it was based in the South. It was also a liberal set show in the South, so it was kind of a very interesting dynamic that we weren't really seeing. The problem that Designing Women has is after season 5, it collapses completely because Burke and Smart leave the show. They're replaced by the very talented Jan Hooks and Julia Duffy, Buffy from SNL, but it doesn't work. And the whole show just starts a death spiral until it's finally put out of its misery. But as James alluded, this is a legitimate queer icon as a show. Like, the gays love it. Literally, the Julia Sugarbaker monologue is a lip sync in RuPaul's Drag Race. That's not a joke. But if I'm looking at the two of them side by side, Roseanne is the stronger show for longer. Amma, where are you on this one?
So I'm going to complicate this in that I'm not switching the other direction, but kind of defending Designing Women by a different calculus, which for me is 80s sitcom. So does it feel as though it's like not necessarily contained by time, but contained by like the aesthetic and the types of things that they talked about? And I think Designing Women feels definitively 80s in a way that Roseanne doesn't, because it does go into the 90s, and then we get the reboot, and then the reboot continues. So it's kind of more abstract as a time period, whereas when I think of Designing Women, I was like, that feels solidly in the 80s, and the way that they talked about things feels in the 80s. So when it comes to the time period, it feels more confined. You couldn't just pick that up and drop it somewhere else.
Okay, great argument. Brendan, where are you?
I'm going to stay with Designing Women also. Suzanne Sugarbaker somehow is both the original Jenna Maroney and Cartman.
That is a great way of putting it, yeah. So here's the fun thing. It's a split 2-2, and of the two, Roseanne is the higher seed. It is the 2 seed, and Designing Women is the 3. So that means that Roseanne will continue into round 2. And that's the end of round 1. We're going to take a quick break to grab a free round of cheers. We'll be right back after these messages.
Another email newsletter? God, I know. But listen, the Great Pop Culture Debate newsletter, it's actually useful. Give us 3 minutes of your lunch break, and we'll tell you all the coolest new stuff in pop culture that week. The biggest new movies in theaters, the hottest new albums about to drop, the TV shows everyone will be talking about. We bring it to you every ball. It's all thriller and no filler, and you'll also find out all the fun news from the podcast. Subscribe today at greatpopculturedebate.com/subscribe.
And we are back for round 2 of our best 80s sitcom debate. Before we get into the Elite 8, I'd like our panelists to share their social media accounts and what else they're working on. Amma, where can people find you? What else are you working on?
I'm on Instagram and YouTube at Amma Marfo. I do have a half-hour special on YouTube called Enjoy Your Nachos, but of the specials that are going to be announced on this episode, I would defer to the other one. But if you have time for 2, throw me in there. I would love it.
Excellent. And absolutely, you should enjoy your nachos as well as watch the other one. Brendan Hay, where can people find you? What are you working on?
People can find me mostly these days over at Blue Sky. I am at bhay, B-H-A-Y, at .bsky.social. They really need to still work on that part of Blue Sky. But otherwise, it's a wonderful place. Also over on Instagram at Brendan Hay Writer. I have season 2 of Gremlins, this time called Gremlins, The Wild Batch. It hits Max coming up very soon, October 3rd, or if you're hearing this, I'm assuming probably after October 3rd. It's now.
It will be out already. It's there. It exists. Yeah.
Enjoy it on Max. And I also have, depending on when this drops in, I believe it's going to be December and January, a 2-parter in the DC comic Brave and the Bold. I have a Robin's story in there, so check that out too.
Awesome. James Adomian, thank you again for joining us for this episode. Can you tell people where they can find you and about what you're working on?
Yes, I like that Brendan mentioned Blue Sky. I just followed you there. I also enjoy Blue Sky. There's not a lot of people there, but the ones that are at the top of society. The finest minds you'll ever encounter. So yeah, I'm on Blue Sky at jadomian.bsky.social. And I'm also on Instagram and Threads at jadomian. And YouTube, James Adomian XOXO. And the big news is my very first stand-up hour special is coming out. It's out as of September 19th, streaming on YouTube with 800 Pound Gorilla. And so you can go to 800poundgorilla.com and find it very easily there. You can go to jamesadomian.com and find it very easily there. We've got smart links that update automatically. Follow the destination as it changes.
Fancy.
So it's Path of Most Resistance, and it's a pretty fun, wild hour.
Awesome. And you've also got, I believe, Harley Quinn is coming back for another season. Is that correct?
Harley Quinn is coming back, I believe, in November.
Ooh, exciting.
And simultaneously, we have Kite Man going as well.
Yes.
Both of them on Mac.
Yeah, so please check all that out. Again, James, we are so delighted to have you here. It's a real thrill for us, so thank you so much. And please go look at Path of Most Resistance on YouTube. You can find me at Eric Rezsnyak on Instagram, or just message at Great Pop Culture Debate on Insta and TikTok, or at GPCD on Mastodon. But what you really need to do right now is sign up for our weekly newsletter, new every Tuesday at noon. It tells you about everything new in pop culture that week. Sign up by finding the link on this episode at greatpopculturedebate.com or via the link tree on any of our social media accounts. It's time for our Patreon shout out. This one to Troy Robinson, who has been one of our very first Patreon supporters all the way back in 2020. He possibly loves the 80s even more than I do. Thank you so much for your support, Troy. And if you'd like a shout out on a future episode, become a Patreon supporter of the podcast today. Now let's move into round two, where we will finally, after all these years, determine who is the boss. JK, it was always Mona. First, it's quite literally girls, as it's another unanimous decision for ultimate 1 seed, the Golden Girls, who can relax on the lanai, while 3 seed, the Facts of Life, enroll in the School of Hard Knocks. But we have barely, if any, talked about the Facts of Life, so I do want us to at least chat about it. Facts of Life was a great show. It was NBC, I believe. It had a good long run. There was a retooling after the first season. You had Mrs., and of course I'm blanking on her name now, Garrett as the school mistress for the gals. You had a great teen cast. Amma, you wanted to say something?
I was just going to say Edna Garrett is her name, and How dare you forget it.
I know, I'm terrible. You had Kim Fields, you had Lisa Welchel, you had Mindy
Cohen.
No, Cohen, thank you.
Yeah,
and I'm forgetting Joe.
Nancy McKeon.
Yes.
Nancy McKeon.
They were all amazing, and it had a good run. It actually introduced the world to George Clooney, fun fact. He came in later on in the run, but it's up against the Golden Girls, and that's pretty much untouchable. Fun fact, I'll say this right now. This has never happened in the Great Pop Culture Debate. Every single person who took the poll for this episode voted for the Golden Girls. Every single person. That has never happened. So just putting that out there. Next, the panelists split between 2 seed Who's the Boss and 4 seed The Jeffersons. James, beans don't burn on the grill, but I need you to bring the heat in your argument for The Jeffersons. I will explain why I still report to the boss. I'll go first on this one. So to me, this is a battle between 2 shows that were solid with great ensemble casts. But Who's the Boss wasn't really pushing any social boundaries, right? It was just a good show. It was just a fun show that people enjoyed, and it had a bunch of great actors. In this one, I think I'm supposed to be defending Who's the Boss, but I actually am probably going to vote for The Jeffersons here. Do you want to talk about it some more, James?
It's so it's such a funny show. I think there's more comedy there. I'm basing this off of watching most of it as a kid, but I feel like once you've seen Who's the Boss about 15 or 20 times, you're done. And if you've seen The Jeffersons 15 or 20 times, you're like, when can I see it again? And it's way more rewatchable now, I think. There is some social commentary in Who's the Boss, but it's kind of out of the way after the opening song. I think Sherman Hemsley is one of the iconic sitcom stars of all time, and I think Face to Face, Vis-a-Vis, it outclasses Who's the Boss.
Yeah. So Amma, you didn't get to make your argument in round 1 for the Jeffersons. Do you want to talk about them now?
Yeah. So I do think that in terms of the legacy of the sitcom as a form, Norman Lear kind of pushed what it was capable of doing. So the situation comedy has comedy, but it can also make those kinds of commentary points that encourage people to have conversations that they might not have otherwise. And as the last Lear show standing in the bracket, I got a stump for it. Again, you've got Sherman Hemsley, you've got Isabel Sanford, absolutely stunningly good. Bob in the chat, all caps, Marla Gibbs, which is something I feel like I yell once a week, just apropos of nothing. Marla Gibbs, so good. And like we mentioned, it does have a little bit of a run in the 70s, but it got some really good steam in the 80s, stayed very good over time. And yeah, I think when you think about the larger impact of what a sitcom can do and has the capacity to do, the Jeffersons pushed that a little bit more than Who's the Boss did, and did it really well.
Yeah. Brendan, we've already established your strong anti-Tony Danza policies. Are you going to go with the Jeffersons here?
I am. I mean, even regardless of the Danza of it all. No, Jeffersons all the way.
Yeah, great. So we're actually make it, I think, unanimous, and the Jeffersons will move into the final four. Next, the panel is leaning toward another round with 1-seed Cheers, but Amma wants to keep visiting with the Huxtables and 3-seed The Cosby Show. Amma, why should The Cosby Show make the final four? James, belly up to the bar as you stump for Cheers. Amma, please go first.
I was really hoping you weren't going to make me go first on this one. So, again, The Cosby Show, having the representation of what it did for black sitcoms overall. Like, the Jeffersons does come from this place of affluent black folks, but with the understanding that they worked so hard to get there, and that might have been really difficult, and just this kind of understanding that it was atypical to be at that level of wealth. Where the Cosby Show just kind of treated that as, no, it's normal. This is where we are. No one's questioning it. It is not the point. It is not the thing to be learned from it. It's just, let's assume these people are where they are, and what situations can they get into. So there were a lot of really fun situations that you can get in that regard, when the wealth was not like the struggle or the spectacle, it was just there. And then, speaking a little bit to something that came up in the warm-up, the idea that A Different World wasn't on here, The Cosby Show being a spinoff of The Different World that not just gave an opportunity to see like black students in a college environment, but exposed HBCUs to the regular mainstream so much so that it had ripple effects over who went. That's not something every sitcom has had the capacity to do. So without The Cosby Show, we wouldn't have gotten that. So when you think about 80s sitcoms as representative entertainment that entertains people, but also something that shifts culture, The Cosby Show started something really, really big, and it feels worthy of note. I love Cheers so much, but it's kind of hard to ignore that part.
Awesome arguments. James Adomian, can you talk to us about Cheers?
Yeah, I think it's a and I didn't get to talk about it in the last round. I guess it must have been unanimous then.
Yep.
Is that what it was? Okay.
Yep.
So I think Cheers, it was as a child, way before I knew the delights and downfalls of alcohol in my life. Cheers, I mean, Cheers had zero impact on my adult life, drinking alcohol. It didn't make me go like, oh, I got to go out there and have beer. I got it. I understood it. I understood it was a bar, and I knew that's what adults did. What it was fascinating was, it was like, as a kid, a way to look at adult life, and it was a little bit edgy, but not too much for TV. And it was not a family sitcom, and there was no overt effort. You know, obviously there's values imposed on from any sort of television narrative. Even the financial news has values, but like there wasn't the overt sort of family values preaching that you see on a lot of family-oriented sitcoms of different kinds. And it also wasn't the workplace sitcom. It was an after-work sitcom. And I mean, yes, it stands on the shoulders of other things that had done something like that. You could argue that Taxi was like that, maybe, where they're kind of at work, but not really very much. But it was an after work. It was such a great idea. It's such a great idea. It's just a sitcom at a bar. It's like the play, The Iceman Cometh, but it just never ends, and it's funny.
The Iceman cometh. Yeah.
Yes, and then I as a child, I loved the corny jokes of Cliff the mailman. I loved I understood I was gay, but I understood, like, okay, these are two a guy and a girl, playing cat and mouse with each other. And I loved Rhea Perlman. Rhea Perlman gets like fantastic like one-off dart lines where she's like hits the punchline out of nowhere. And Norm gets these like deserved entrance applause, as if it's like a great actor playing Willie Loman in Death of a Salesman. He gets these huge, great, deserved entrance lines. And even I'm a kid watching it, and I don't know what it's like to be drunk except watching cartoons. But it was funny because you got to fantasize that you could hang out in an adult world for a second. And it was really, really tightly hilarious. Most episodes, like, really fantastic comedy play. And it doesn't really very much leave the bar at all, very rarely.
Yeah.
So it's all kind of there, like a play taking place in one place. And you hear about other places and stories. And I just thought it was an extremely inventive world, and it was paid off in the comedy writing more than it had to. It was funnier than it had to be, really.
Yeah, great argument. Did George Wendt ever do Death of a Salesman? I don't know, but now I want to see it.
Now I want to see it, right?
Yeah. Brendan Hay, this is a tough one. This could be a Final Four matchup for me. Is it going to be Cosby Show or Cheers?
I mean, I think this should be Final Four, because I think that's a very reasonable thing. That said, Cheers is pretty much the platonic ideal for me of a sitcom. Cosby Show's great. It is, and also highly rewatchable. I'm almost having a moment of swinging back that way, but I am going to go Cheers. Like yeah.
I'm also going to go Cheers on this one. That ensemble is one of the strongest ensembles in sitcom history, and it's an ensemble that withstood cast changes brilliantly. That is a very rare act, and I think it really succeeded there. So I apologize, Amma, but we are going to move Cheers into the Final Four. Did you want to say something?
I mean, I get it. I absolutely get it. It was a really difficult decision, and I also, while this is not the reasoning that has been brought behind it, it is very difficult to then just be like, we're moving the Cosby Show into the Final Four. So I completely understand on all fronts how we got here. No permanent damage done.
Wonderful. Finally, in a round 2 matchup I did not see coming at all, it's 4-seed Perfect Strangers and 2-seed Roseanne. I'm just going to go around the horn on this one. James Adomian, between Roseanne and Perfect Strangers, which one are you going to go with?
Oh, right. Yes, this is upends, Oliver.
It does. And that's what we love to do on this show. It makes things interesting.
I think between these, I actually had picked Perfect Strangers going one more.
Okay.
But now having thought about it and everybody's bringing up some good things that I may have forgotten. And I think Roseanne remains an iconic sort of, I was just talking about the after work sitcom of Cheers, and Roseanne maybe has the powerhouse laughs to match that. And it happens to be the family version of it. And, it goes a little longer. Into the 90s, I'm going to stick with Roseanne on this. I think on the big laughs.
Great. Amma, Marfo, is it going to be Perfect Strangers or Roseanne?
Brackets busted all over the place.
Correct.
Just
yes.
Shattered on the floor. I have to give it to Perfect Strangers here because again, just something about the 80s-ness of Perfect Strangers makes it feel like if we're picking one to go forward, again, that premise in theory could go in any decade, but the way that they executed it, it feels very of its time, and its time was the 80s.
Interesting. Brendan Hayes, a Perfect Strangers or Roseanne?
Gonna follow Amma on that same exact logic. Perfect Strangers just because it feels more like, no, that show's not getting greenlit any other time other than the 80s. It just feels like a perfect encapsulation. The Cold War kind of vibe, the performances, everything. Yeah. Roseanne, I think there is still a version of Roseanne airing now. I think Roseanne's probably the better show. Perfect Strangers is the more 80s show.
Damn it, this is tough because I agree. Roseanne is easily the better show. And listen, I'm not knocking Perfect Strangers at all, but the argument that Perfect Strangers is quintessentially 80s in a way that Roseanne is not is probably not a bad one. So, James, are we going to be terribly frustrated if we move Perfect Strangers into that Final Four?
No, I think it's that funny. I mean, I was originally arguing for it. I'm happy to flip back. I don't have any courage of my convictions on this.
None of us do. Courage. Yeah, who needs it?
I feel like oh, you mean you're just gonna switch back? I feel like it could be a Perfect Strangers plot line. Oh, suddenly now we're back. We're voting again.
Exactly.
What is this voting, cousin?
Cousin Balky needs some help. But no, all right. So you know what? Who saw this coming? Perfect Strangers moving into the Final Four, ladies and gentlemen. And with that, we do have a Final Four. We're going to take a quick break to film some The More You Know PSAs, Star Wipe. We'll be right back after these messages.
Hey there. If you're enjoying this episode of The Great Pop Culture Debate, and I sure hope you are, we would love for you to consider supporting the show on Patreon. Patreon sponsorships start at $5 a month and include loads of great perks, including access to our super active Discord server, exclusive episodes, and warm-ups you won't hear anywhere else. And at the $10 level or higher, your own GPCD tote bag, which is only fitting, as this is basically our version of an NPR pledge drive. We can only produce this show with your support, so please consider heading to patreon.com/greatpopculturedebate and joining us today.
And we are back with the final four of our best 80s sitcom debate. At this point in the show, I always like to take a step back and see if it shook out the way I expected it to. Absolutely not. I also like to add at this point that no matter which option wins, we're celebrating all of these shows, and I hope nobody gets salty about what comes next. We have a 1 seed, The Golden Girls, versus a 4 seed, The Jeffersons, and another 1 seed, Cheers, versus another 4 seed, Perfect Strangers. I cannot think of another case in which this has ever happened. I'm living for the chaos. And honestly, what's more authentic 80s than that, right? Just chaos. I'm gonna go around the horn. 1 seed The Golden Girls versus 4 seed Jeffersons. Amma, where are you gonna vote?
Jeffersons.
Okay, Brendan Hay, 1 seed Golden Girls versus 4 seed The Jeffersons.
All of my original picks, except for 2, have gotten knocked out. So I'm happy that I'm going to just try to push for the final 2 that I would have anyway. Golden Girls.
James Adomian, Golden Girls versus The Jeffersons.
I haven't gotten to argue for it, and I think it is maybe probably the greatest sitcom of all time, The Golden Girls, and I think that it's so unexpected. And speaking of like after work, it's like after career. It's an after career sitcom. And it just shows that there's a lot of life to enjoy and be involved in besides just a work or a biological family.
Yeah,
it's just one of the funniest shows ever made.
Yeah, I'm gonna also vote for Golden Girls here. I think we rewatched the entire thing during the pandemic. We even watched the spinoff Golden Palace, which everybody hated. And listen, it's not great, but it's also not terrible. Like, you can't have 3/4 of the Golden Girls and have it be terrible. You know what I mean? And so for me, this one, it has to move into the final 2. We've barely talked about it. It Ursulaed its way to the finals, but deservedly so. Next, it's 1 seed Cheers versus 4 seed Perfect Strangers. I'd like to start with James Adomian. Is it Cheers or Perfect Strangers?
I think here it's going to be Cheers. Similar to The Golden Girls, it's one of the funniest television shows ever made. It's deeply memorable. It feels, when you see it, it feels like it was just made 5 years ago. It feels like it's very current. It does not feel. I mean, it's timeless. It's obviously there's production quality from the '80s and some references of technology and stuff, but there's a timelessness to it. And I think for many reasons, highest of all, how funny it is. Cheers.
Brendan Hay, is it going to be Cheers or Perfect Strangers?
Yeah, Cheers all the way. Sitcoms that I can still remember exact line readings, that I can still remember exact scenes and jokes from. It's Cheers.
Amma, Marfo, is it going to be Cheers or Perfect Strangers?
I've been giggling over here because I genuinely can't believe we're here.
I know, it's wild. I love it.
Wild. With that said, Cheers is the win here. I think that Perfect Strangers feels quintessentially 80s in that you couldn't really do it anywhere else, but there's also something very comforting about the 80s giving us this timeless show. The show that was of its moment for what it did, but is timeless in terms of how you can continue to relate to it and the types of characters that it put forward and the types of relationships that you would see. So yes, at last it may be Perfect Strangers' time to go. It had a hell of a run. The Cinderella story of the bracket.
Cinderella story.
Absolutely. I'm going to make it a clean sweep for Cheers. I just think this is an ensemble show that did it better than anybody else. And I can still remember being 10 years old when that Cheers finale was, the hype for that was massive. They had a huge check to write and they did it. Like they actually succeeded with a massively hyped finale and nailed it. And how often does that happen? But that gives us a final 2. 1 seed The Golden Girls versus 1 seed Cheers. I do think this is the correct final 2. I would like to start in the middle. Brendan Hay, where are you going?
Okay, so this was my own final 2. I would be happy with either of these 2 winning. I really do feel, going into this, when I was rewatching stuff, I'm like, these are the 2 funniest still to me to this day. And because I think they're also the strongest character shows. These are, you can say any of the characters on either shows, just their first names or their names, and you'll immediately be like, oh, I know who Norm is. I know who Blanche is. I know, like, that kind of a thing. And it's fantastic. I'm torn. Cheers rings in my head a little bit more on the comedy side. I also, though, have a little bit more of the nostalgia play on Golden Girls from watching that on my go-to babysitter growing up was my grandma, and I'd watch that on Saturday nights with my grandma whenever my parents went out, and bonding. There's some great intergenerational bonding there, and also I'm pretty sure I first learned about sex probably from the Golden Girls. Maybe that explains a lot. I don't know. But it's basically nostalgia versus comedy. I'll go Golden Girls, but I could easily be swayed.
If you're going to learn from sex, you can learn from no one better than Blanche. Like, let's just get into it, Devereaux. Amma, Marfo, is it going to be Cheers or is it going to be the Golden Girls?
I'm giving it to Cheers because in aggregate, as a program, we give so much love to the Golden Girls. We do. We love the Golden Girls. Undeniable. And I feel like if there were a case to kind of honor a show that weren't that, this is the opportunity to honor Cheers for the incredible thing that it did. When we think about sitcom, I think family is the thing that tends to come up most often. And these are two essentially found families against each other. So it's ones that live together versus ones that have created the third place together. And I feel like if Cheers were to take the win here, there would be no shortage of appreciation in other places for the Golden Girls. So for that reason, I'm going to let Cheers take the win here.
We may have a Best Golden Girls episode already in the can for the Great Pop Culture Debate. James Adomian, is it going to be Golden Girls or Cheers for you?
This is the right two finalists, I think. They're the two shows that hold up the best. If the society collapses, they're the ones that need to have all the episodes saved or taught to reenact to future generations. They're both very funny. As it was said, they're both sort of found families. I think that's a really great observation. And I just think if either one of them is on, I'm watching it. I'm going to seek either one of them out. And both of them are better than a lot of stuff that's on TV now. And there is that factor, too, where it's like, should I watch something new or should I just actually watch something I know I love and haven't seen in a while? Both of these shows are really great for that. And I think I got to stick with the Golden Girls ultimately because it is so quotable. Not that Cheers is not, but the Golden Girls is like more quotable than the Big Lebowski. You know, it's like it has the lines. And so it's nice to relive that because sometimes I forget certain great lines from the Golden Girls, and it is love. And it's also like there's a great Wile E. Coyote element to it where Blanche is going to Dorothy's going to make a remark to Blanche. You don't know exactly what it's going to be. And I love living through that again like it's the first time. So I'm going with the Golden Girls.
Yeah, I think you had a really interesting argument, Amma, that like the Golden Girls has become so popular that can't we give something else its flowers right now? And I'm giving both of these shows these flowers, and I do think this is the correct final two for the 80s. These I think are the two most, and Cosby Show's right there in that pantheon of like 80s all-time great shows. But I think there's a reason that the Golden Girls continue to have that cachet, right? Like I own Golden Girls Clue. I own Golden Girls Trivial Pursuit, me, myself. I may or may not have caftans that are patterned after the ones that they wear. There's a reason that it continues to have this relevance, and it's not just strictly nostalgia. There's something, and yes, is this coming from a mostly homosexual point of view? For sure. But where's the norm loungewear line? You know what I mean? Where does that exist? It doesn't. I think that there's a reason that it continues to be as culturally potent now, 40 years later, as it was when it was on the air. And I think these are two amazing final shows. So great job, everybody. But there you have it, folks. Our pick for the best 80s sitcom is The Golden Girls. Do you agree? Do you think we need to retire to a private group home in Florida? Tell us how you really feel by leaving a comment on this episode at greatpopculturedebate.com or find us on Instagram, Facebook, Threads, TikTok, or Mastodon. While you're there, make sure you subscribe and follow the podcast so you can hear about what new debates are coming soon, vote in open polls, and even decide which topics we tackle next. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a minute to like and rate it on whatever platform you listen on. I want to say thank you to my panel. We'll find out which one of you is popular enough for your own spinoff. And an extra special thanks to James Adomian, whose comedy special Path of Most Resistance is available right now on YouTube, and you should go watch it. And thank you for listening. If you loved what you heard, please consider supporting us on Patreon, where you can get even more exclusive content and you get episodes a whole day early. We hope you have a good one. And remember, everyone is entitled to their wrong opinions. Next time on a very special episode of the Great Pop Culture Debate.